We, uh, we are recording this conversation. If you prefer not to be recorded, please mute your mic and disable your video. Actually, everyone is muted except for our participants, our speakers. By continuing to participate in this conversation with your video and audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. We will stop recording now to allow you to disable your video and audio if you prefer to be recorded. Elaine Howard Ecklund is the professor of sociology at Rice University in Houston, Texas, where she founded the Religion and Public Life program. She holds the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences. She's written 5 books, including Science and Religion, What Scientists Really Think. She speaks regularly at churches about the intersection of science and spirituality, and her research has been cited frequently by US and international publications. She's one of the 50 women to watch named by Christianity Today, and she's been featured in various venues. And we are just delighted to have her join us for a conversation today. Interviewing Elaine will be Hannah Eagleson. Hannah's my colleague with Emerging Scholars Network, our associate director, and so and herself an author, the editor of our book, Science and Faith, which includes a number of helpful articles on the relationship of sciences and faith as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah. And we're very glad to have you with us, Elaine, and with everyone else who's participating.
Well, welcome everyone, as Bob said. And Elaine, we're so glad you could join us today. So I'm actually speaking to you from Ithaca, New York, where I know you did 3 degrees at Cornell University, which is just up the hill from where I am at the moment. And I've been reflecting on how, in many ways, your work is a response to the first president of Cornell, A.D. White, who was one of the people who famously popularized the theory that science and at least certain kinds of religion are deeply in conflict. And so you, over the years, have surveyed over 41,000 scientists and believers, and of course, people who are both. And one of the big questions that you're answering as a social scientist is, what do scientists and religious believers actually think about science and religion? And in your newest book that we're discussing today, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, you approach this question by identifying 8 values that scientists and Christians tend to share. And you explore some ways that we can connect around those values and the virtues that those values tend to encourage. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me among those values is the value of curiosity, of wanting to learn about many different things, which is valuable in belief and also in science. And one question I thought would be especially relevant to our audience today of Christian academics is, you know, curiosity is often a key reason that people become grad students and faculty members, one of the things that moves them into that career path. And yet in the daily rush of work, it can feel as though that rush is keeping us from being curious or keeping us from being able to follow up on our curiosity. Do you have any advice on how to keep cultivating that value in the midst of hectic work schedules?
I do. Thank you, Hannah, for having me. I just want to say before I answer that amazing question, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to see some familiar faces. I want to say openly that I really credit InterVarsity with helping me retain, and more important than retain my faith, really deepen my faith during my university years at Cornell University. And I love InterVarsity so much. I spent 3 years as a staff person. And I just think that the conversation is a great ministry and a really significant ministry. So I want to just say that out loud. So in terms of curiosity, I think that the current academic world works against nurturing the virtue of curiosity. So what do I mean by that? Those folks on the call who are graduate students, who are faculty, quickly, I think, experience what I mean. So in the sciences and social sciences, you're coming into a PhD program. First, you have coursework, you have all kinds of responsibilities to advisors and people who have power over you. You're trying to figure out your own research agenda in the midst of all that. Faculty who run big labs or who get grants, who work at research universities, are almost entrepreneurs and business corporate folks in a kind of funny way. There's been several books written about the corporatization of the university, and I do really experience that myself. So my day is filled with lots of meetings, and as soon as I get close to running out of grant money, I currently have 17 staff, students, and postdocs that I'm responsible for funding. And so that feels like a kind of tyranny of the urgent in terms of all of those things that we need to do to get ahead. For folks who are at more teaching-oriented universities, there is constant course prep and student meetings, and trying to sometimes figure out how to put together enough classes as an adjunct to make a living. And so that kind of structure of the university works against nurturing curiosity, which I think needs space and time and a sense of accountability of others, of like-minded others who value being curious at its core as a way of understanding who God is and the creation in relationship to our discipline. And so I say all of that, you know how faculty are, you ask one question and we give a speech. I'll try to cut it back a little bit, Hannah, to leave room for others. But I say all of that to say that to nurture it, curiosity, one will need to actively sometimes develop a discipline or set of disciplines that work against the natural flow of what the university has become. And I would say it wasn't until maybe just a couple of years ago that I really realized that. I think for a long time I believed that you go into academics because you're curious about the world and there'll just be all this opportunity to sit around and discuss big ideas. And I do not find that to be the case. I don't know about others on the call, but I do not find that to be the case. Maybe you want to press me in a different direction, Hannah. I'm happy to follow up.
I'm curious if there are what particular disciplines have helped you, maybe one or two that have helped you stay curious.
So I think of the counteracting disciplines. So there are things which do not help me remain curious. So I get right now about 300 emails a day, and that I could just literally spend 7 hours a day just answering email and doing nothing else. And so I have to put some kind of time limit on it. So I do section off my day to the point that I have control. I section off my day so that I only spend about an hour on email. I try to get to things really quickly, and more relational emails I leave to the weekend until I have time to respond to those more thoughtfully. I also try to keep meetings to those which are really necessary. So I do, and I also have accountability partners in my church that I meet with, where I kind of share very openly. I'm very close to our pastor in our church that we attend. My husband's also an academic, and so I would say that he's in physics, is a kind of accountability partner as well. And so I have 2 or 3 people in my life who are always asking me why I'm doing what I'm doing. Was that next grant that I applied for functional, or is it something that's about the larger mission that I'm on, my sense of calling? And so there's a set of things that I think I do to create space. And then when I have the space, for me, it's really important to always be doing some kind of reading outside of my particular subject area or the things I have to be doing right now, and to stay in relationship with people, especially Christians who are outside of my own discipline, and to have conversations with them about what interesting things are going on in their field, and for us to dream together how our fields connect. And then I think there are things outside of academia that are important to nurture a sense of the joy of discovery in our own lives, and kind of to bake that sensibility into our lives. And I really love music. I love classical music. I have a child who's now 11, but when she was like 3 or 4, we started doing a lot of art together. And I am not a great artist, so I don't do it because I'm necessarily, this is one of my special gifts, but I do a lot of art with her because I like colors and how they go together, and I like thinking about that a little bit and experiencing it. And that is something which makes me more creative and more curious about other aspects of my life. And I don't think this is something that can necessarily be explained in a purely rationalistic sense, but it's a more of an experience. Doing art and experiencing music gets me in the framework of being curious as a way of life. And so for me, it would be counterproductive to nurturing curiosity not to allow time and space for those kind of things. And even if it's 10 minutes, and I think sometimes we're so all or nothing, we think we need to have some enormous retreat. And if we can't do that, then it's not worth it at all, right? And so my program is called SOME. So I think, and I always say to my students I work with, that SOME is better than none, which is another kind of program. And so if I could do 5 minutes of something that nurtures a creative spirit, then I'd rather do that than not do anything at all. And that sometimes helps me get in a frame of mind. And then the last thing I would say is that as faculty or as people who are in leadership, who are campus ministers, I know are on the call, sometimes you feel like you have to know everything to retain your position somehow. There's this sort of existential crisis about that often. And I do learn a lot from my students. And more lately, I've felt the freedom to listen to the things that they're interested in as a way of nurturing my own curiosity as well.
Well, thank you for those very helpful answers. I think those have some wonderful models that people on the call can adapt to their own experience. Kind of along those lines, you know, one of the other things you write about in this chapter is how important it is for church to be a welcoming place for curiosity, especially in terms of the sciences. And you point out that perhaps the most valuable resource for helping churches do that is the community of believers who have already successfully integrated faith and science in their lives, scientists in the church. And many of the people on this call are in that category or are learning how to be in that category. And I guess in the spirit of your "some is better than none" approach, what are some practical and doable ways that Christian scholars can bring their experience integrating science and faith into the life of the local church?
There's a lot of different kinds of answers to that question. I think it's kind of a complicated question. And so a couple of things quickly come to mind, Hannah. So one is that I think pastors, those who are in full-time professional ministry, I mean, we're all ministers, but those who vocationally are in ministry, sometimes can do more to help academics or scientists in their midst understand that their scientific work is a kind of spiritual calling, and can be done in such a way that's a generative spiritual ministry. And so that to me is a kind of first step. Even my husband, who went to seminary for a couple of years, reads theology literally constantly. So when we've recently in the past few years started a science and faith ministry in our church. But before that, when people asked him what he did for his work, I shouldn't be using him as an example and he's not on the call. That's not really fair to him, but he's heard me tell this story before. When people ask him, so what do you do for your work? And he'd be like, oh, I work at the university. And finally we got our pastor, and I, said to him at one point, it would be really useful if you told people a little bit more detail about your work as a physicist and how you think about that in relationship to your faith. And over time, he really has started saying more about that, because I think those kind of examples can be extremely generative to inquisitive children who think that they might be interested in science, or just to believers of all sorts who think that there is just not a way for these things to be in the same identity, for one to be vocationally a physicist and also a very committed Christian. And so that's a kind of example or a model. And so I think that starts with pastors making a space, a kind of an honorable space to talk about those kind of things. I do think too that churches can be places where children in particular and young adults can ask hard questions of the faith in a safe environment. So curious questions. And so I know Hannah gave me a little bit of a preview of the questions she might ask. So I know we'll get to doubt in a bit, but I do think there's a fear sometimes on the part of parents, on the part of pastors and campus ministers and youth ministers, of asking of children and young adults asking hard questions of the faith, for fear that those questions will lead to them leaving. And I remember someone well known who's escaping me now. So this wasn't me who said this, but the Christian faith is not a fragile faith. And so there is, and I found this to be true in my own life, that even if I don't know the answer to a question that my child asks, I know there's someone in the broader Christian community who's probably wrestled with that type of question. And so I think it's important for us to talk openly about our vocations as scientists in a way that gives people examples. I think it's important for faith leaders, for pastors and youth ministers in particular, and parents and those who care about raising children, which is really the whole church community, not just people who have biological children, to encourage and nurture asking questions, just anything that you're curious about in the faith community, and kind of naming that. I think it's important to name that in our communities, that this is a place where it's safe for you to be curious about the edges of the faith, the things that we don't talk about as being at the center, and to ask those hard questions.
That's wonderful. And along those lines, you do have a wonderful chapter about doubt in this book, where you explore how, although we can feel afraid of doubt, it's often the thing that makes us revise our limited views of God and our limited views of the natural world, and discover something new about the reality of who God is and the reality of how he created nature. And so I found that chapter really compelling and really helpful. And I guess I'm curious maybe about two aspects of that. One is, what can we as believing academics learn from people like the disciple Thomas, who you point to as a much more positive role model than he's often presented as, for the way that he explores doubt? And then beyond the Christian community, how can being honest about our doubts help us build bridges with secular colleagues in science?
Those are great questions. I think of Thomas as perhaps one of the world's first scientists, right? He wanted to touch it. I do think sometimes, the examples of people who doubt are lauded in a negative way. And this is the thing that I've spent a lot of time in the past 15 years interviewing and surveying scientists, but probably the same amount of time interviewing and surveying people of all faiths and no faith about what they think about science and the science and faith intersection. And Christians, committed Christians, are somewhat unique in amidst them, and I'm kind of getting a little far afield, but I'll come back to it, Hannah, are somewhat unique when compared to people of other faith traditions, in that they actually are very positive about science. It's a stereotype that I think is sometimes transmitted among academics and among the media, that Christians, are not science friendly. They actually love science, but they're very afraid, my studies show, of scientists, and very concerned that scientists that kids meet in university environments will say things to their kids that will take them away from the Christian faith. And that's why they're so much more likely to think that a faith-based school or is better than a school that is quote unquote secular. I mean, I have problems with that terminology, but sort of how we think about it. And because they're scared of scientists as people and professors in other disciplines as well. And I think that part of that fear comes from not nurturing safe doubt within church communities, not providing spaces where youth can really question. And I think that's why parachurch ministries like InterVarsity can be so important, because we have, the broader university context. Then you have this group of folks that you can meet with often. That's a sub-community within the larger university community where you can really wrestle with things together. And I think that creating those kind of environments earlier in churches is extremely important. About all kinds of things. I mean, we're having, InterVarsity is one of the first places in the academy where, as an undergrad, I really experienced thoughtful conversations about racism in our society. Obviously, this is an enormous discussion right now, and I hope it continues. And students and youth need safe places where they can doubt not just the science and faith interface, but doubt how the faith has responded in other kinds of issues historically, and wrestle through what that means for them and their lives. The other thing I would say about doubt is it's important to make sure that we don't have a view of doubt that's like one and done. It's a matter of just having the 2 sentences that respond to that question. My husband is particularly good at this. So I always think when my daughter asks a question, I'm always like, okay, let me give the great answer. And he always says, oh, that's not the question she's asking. She's asking this other question, and she just wants to ask the question. So, lately, as she has aged a bit, it's more, the answer more often is like, that is a good type of question to be asking. Or, that's not the right question to be asking. This is the better question to be asking. Sometimes people just want a safe place to ask the questions and to feel like they'll be heard, and to find others, interlocutors, those who've gone before them who also are asking those questions.
Along those lines, I've often found that my conversations with people who are not believers are deepest when I do express my own doubts about aspects of the faith, or things I've had to think through over time, things I'm still not certain about. And I'm curious how in your research you've seen expressing those doubts as a way for people to connect across differences of faith or lack of faith.
I think people are suspicious of others who seem to have it all together. So that's just kind of something I feel like I've been experiencing recently. I think there's a kind of respect, especially recently, for honesty, where we as Christians say, you make a good point. I haven't thought about that. That does cause me to doubt. It's funny, my colleagues who I would say I have sets of colleagues. I definitely have sets of colleagues who are committed Christians. I have sets of colleagues who just kind of don't care. They're like, if it works for you, great. And I have sets of colleagues who are pretty dang negative. And the sort of more negative ones are often trying to kind of in a classic way give me an aha moment, if that makes sense. Like, have you thought about this? And I think it's okay to say, And I'm very interested to hear what others think, if you agree or disagree or have something to add with what I'm saying right now. I think it's okay to say, I haven't thought about that. That does cause me to pause. You raise a good point. That does cause me some doubts about that aspect of something. But I am okay wrestling with that. I'm okay talking to you about it. If there is a way we can understand that we don't have to have all the answers, and that both, obviously, God is outside of our systems, both our natural science systems and our social science systems, and we do not know completely the mind of God. And I think that that's something we all assent to intellectually, but experiencing that is quite something different. And that kind of humility is often an antidote to the fear that surrounds doubt.
Well, thank you so much for that really helpful answer. I wish that we had time to explore some of the other values, such as creativity and awe that you point to in the book, but that will give people a chance to explore further. And at this moment, I'd like to just take a break and kind of point people to the book, and then we'll come back and do some questions and answers. While I'm telling you about the book, please do feel free to put some questions that you have in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the Q&A time. So Elaine's most recent book, as we said, is Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. I enjoyed it very much and highly recommend it personally as well as professionally. And Baker has generously given us 30% off for those who attended this event. And so if you click on the link that Bob has so kindly put in the chat here, you'll be able to purchase it at 30% off. And I really hope you enjoy the chance to read it. It's very engagingly written and summarizes the fruit of extensive research in a way that's really compelling. So we really hope you get a chance to browse it later. We will make this recording available later. I noticed someone asked about it, and yes, this will be available on our YouTube channel not too long after. I don't know our exact ETA at the moment, but it definitely will be. So I think it's a good time to swap over to questions. And as you think of them, please continue to put them in the chat and I will moderate them. Elaine, I'd like to start with a question about different models for connecting faith and work in academia. So we talk a lot at ESN about different ways of doing that. For some people, it's big scale philosophical connections between faith and particle physics or something like that. For other people, it's, I realized I'm doing these really nitty gritty statistics, but I can serve my colleagues through them. There are just many different models. Obviously, this book represents a really interesting synthesis of a number of ways that you've connected the two over the years. Would you tell us a little bit of your own story of connecting those things in your life?
Yeah, that's been kind of a journey. I think it's, so I guess I'll start back. I would say I've had several different models over the course of my academic career so far. Just to totally transparent, I'm going on 48 years old, whatever that means to folks. So it's not really young, but maybe I have a few more years left in the academy. And I would say when I was a graduate student, for me, the integration of faith and my work as an academic, as a social scientist, was much more about connecting ideas. So how could I understand the ideas that I was learning, to what extent they conflicted with what I had learned, in my understanding of Christian teaching so far? Who could I find who could help me wrestle with ideas? For social scientists, is a lot about to what extent is faith completely socially constructed, and how do we understand that and the significance of it? Does Christian faith in particular lead to structures that have been bad for society? How do we think about that? So those are the kinds of questions I was struggling with. My life changed a lot after graduate school. I got married after graduate school. I moved to the southern United States, which is a very different bird for faith than the Northeast, where I cut my teeth as an academic. Very different. And almost like a different country, really. I can't state that enough. And I had a child later on. And so then what it meant to integrate faith and my academic work was a different kind of question. I had more roles. I became very involved in my church, and that was a kind of a role. And so it became a lot about time management and much more practice oriented than idea oriented. So how much time was I going to spend on certain kinds of things, and how much of my life was I going to give to academic work versus other kinds of work? And I would say towards middle age and beyond, my questions are much more about integrating across roles. That I used to think of integrating faith at work as really like divvying up these boxes, I would say, in my young parenting and academic life. And now I think of it more as, how can I be a whole person? And what does that mean at work? Not to hide that I'm a Christian, or to display the pieces of my identity as a Christian. And then likewise at church, the pieces of my identity that seem most relevant to the church kind of conversations we're having. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but what does it mean to be a whole person in those contexts? Recognizing that we don't tell everyone everything all the time, right? That there are sort of different levels of relationship, but I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a whole person. And that actually kind of that journey resulted in this book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, which is, yes, I hope you will buy the book. My press and publicists tell me to say that all the time. But it's an interesting, I think I'm happy to talk more about those for those who are interested. It's been a very difficult journey for me to come to the place where I should write this book. I share a lot about, in the book, about faith and science being a very personal struggle I've had since I was a preteen, pretty significant rheumatoid arthritis, and what it's meant to wrestle with science, medicine, and faith in my own life. I know others on the call have had alike experiences. And what it's meant to be an academic, to be married to a natural scientist. And so all of those things I talk about in the book, and telling one's personal story alongside research is not really something that I would usually do or feel comfortable doing, and actually is a bit looked down upon, quite frankly, in my own discipline, which is trying to fight to be viewed as a science. And so then telling personal narrative alongside supposedly scientific work is viewed as a real no-no. And so I was concerned about how my colleagues would view the book. And I really thought a lot about that, about my own positionality, how, the students that I'm responsible for. I work with a variety of different graduate students. Some of them are very committed Christians. Some of them are very committed atheists. Some of them are very committed persons of other faiths. And I wondered how, the pieces of my identity that then affect their professional success would have an impact on them. So I actually asked those of them that I know better to read the book, and to make sure if they were comfortable with it, how they would feel about their advisor writing such a book. And so that's been kind of a journey as well.
And a comment from Dave Vosberg, who says, thanks for taking that risk, Elaine. Much appreciated. Kind of along those lines, I love the way that you've described a journey of different models, and how integrating faith and work can be really different at different points in our lives in healthy ways. Jason asks, you've talked a lot today about how your work speaks into doubt. How does your work speak into the experience of suffering, and how suffering can inform or bolster our faith? And I know you wrestle with that both in terms of personal narrative and in terms of research and larger philosophical questions in the book.
Yeah, I think my own particular work as a social scientist, sometimes I think the best social science tells people's stories in the aggregate. So tells the collection of stories, not just one story. One story is very important, but our tools are more about telling the aggregate story truthfully. And so I think about much of my work deals with the intersection between religion and science. Other pieces of my work deal with the intersection among race and immigration and religion. And within both of those domains of research, there are stories of suffering. And so one way in which I think my academic work, I've tried to use it to address suffering in our society broadly, is bringing to light aggregate suffering. I don't think, this is an interesting sort of philosophic question that I've wrestled with. I don't think sociology has within itself the ability to comment on what we ought to do about suffering necessarily. I think at its best, there are definitely, as I say this out loud, I'm like, there are colleagues who would disagree with me, but I'm speaking now. I do think at its best, it's a kind of a descriptive discipline, that it doesn't in and of itself bring justice to the world, that you need some sort of supra model of justice to address suffering that's from something else. And so I see my job as bringing to light the suffering as it's understood from the point of view of the people suffering in the aggregate. And so what is that, and what does that mean? I don't know if someone wants to follow up with a part 2 to that question. And then I thought in this book that I just wrote, what would it mean to set my own story as almost as if I were one of my interview respondents alongside the collection of stories of others, and say, here's what I'm experiencing, and how does that fit into what other people have experienced as well, as a way of connecting with the readers and hopefully giving a kind of touch point for people to communicate with me about the ideas. We also know through research that story is a way that we learn things, and Jesus told such powerful stories, and there's something within our makeup as human beings that craves a good story. And so I've started to think lately about, what kind of story am I telling with my research? Is it a faithful and good story? Is it accurate in as much as I know within what I know now? And in particular, how might it be used by others to alleviate suffering? So those are some thoughts I'm having right now.
I really like that way of framing it. I guess as a PhD in English literature, I would really like the story way of framing it, but that's a wonderful way to put it. Shifting veins a little bit, one of the other questions we've received is, in your research, did you find that there were certain subfields within science that seemed to be more or less open to people of faith and faith in general? If so, what were the reasons behind that?
That's a sort of complex question. So I have done several different kinds of studies, and one study that our team, my team and I'm the first author on a book with 6 other authors. It's called Secularity in Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And that's the product of an 8-nation study where we surveyed 22,000 scientists. And we looked just at all fields of biology and physics, and something we noticed across national contexts, across fields, which is quite interesting because we surveyed scientists from nations that are as different as Turkey, India, and the UK. And we found that those in the more applied disciplines, so say the pieces of physics that are more like engineering. So engineers do not like it when I say that they're applied physicists. I've noticed, don't say that when you're speaking at physics conferences, but or at engineering conferences. So, but I think that one can understand, the more technical and applied pieces of discipline and the more abstract pieces of disciplines, right? Like the theorists of the discipline. We have found that applied disciplines seem to have no problem with faith. So the levels of religiosity, and this is independent of the type of university, whether you're at a more elite or less elite university, a more teaching-oriented school or not. It seems that the more applied pieces of the faith are more likely to be religion positive and more likely to have the same levels of religiosity as the rest of the population in a given nation. So that's kind of interesting. So the applied versus the not applied pieces across all disciplines. Beyond that, it seems to differ by discipline according to national context. So for example, physicists and biologists in the US have about the same levels of religiosity, but in the UK, physicists tend to be much more religious, especially there's a higher proportion of Christians among UK physicists when compared to UK biologists. And then these are kind of, when you interview scientists, it's really neat because they're generally very bright people, and so you can put your hypothesis to them and get their ideas. So we interviewed them, and the UK physicists were like, well, of course, because we have all these great exemplars like Michael Faraday of what it means to be a Christian and be a scientist. And, you know, in biology in the UK has had almost as many problems with evolution and evolution acceptance among the broader public as we have in the US, but in particular, the kind of distancing. So Islam is has a more of a public impact in the UK than it does in the US. And there's concern among biologists that immigrant Muslims coming into the UK will have a negative, a deleterious impact on biology and the underpinnings of biology. So there's those kind of conversations in national context that are going on. And in an earlier study, we interviewed and surveyed social scientists when compared to natural scientists. And so in that study, we looked at 4 fields of natural science and 4 fields of social science, and found that social scientists were a bit less religious than natural scientists, partly for political reasons, in that there's a correlation between politics and religion often, where people who are more conservative politically are also more likely to be religious. It's hard to know causality there. And what kind of depth of religiosity you're talking about. So there's lots of studies of this for those that are interested. And that social science tends to draw people who are more politically liberal when compared to natural science. When you get into the higher, like the very research active universities, that effect kind of washes out. That's particularly pronounced in smaller art schools and other like universities that focus more on university and colleges, I should say, that focus more on teaching. When we get to the research universities, social sciences and natural sciences have a little bit more similar levels of religiosity. That may have been more technical than the questioner was asking, or maybe not technical enough.
That's really interesting. And certainly if people have follow-up questions on that, feel free to type them into the chat. I noticed that Stephen has asked, what about the converse question? What aspects of science are more accepted in the church than others? And Stephen comments that it seems that biology and climate science are types of science that the church tends to be more suspicious of.
That's right. So, yeah, and especially particular sectors of the church. So from a sociological point of view, when we look at Christianity globally, we consider evangelical Christianity and the denominations which are likely to be considered evangelical, like Southern Baptists, and mainline Christians, so the classic Methodists, Episcopalians, and we think also in other national contexts, not as big in the US, but Orthodox Christianity, was Russian and Greek Orthodoxy. And so I mean, there's different, and the Catholic Church, of course. So evangelical Christians in the US are having problems with evolution. And that's been going on for years and years now. It was not so much the case in the early 1900s. That really, there's actually been quite a lot of good stuff. There's a great book by the historian Ronald Numbers, who's a friend of mine, called The Creationists, which kind of takes you through the history of this. It's a big book. And if you really want to get into this, what is interesting to me as a sociologist is why does that seem to be the case, and what kinds of other views does this sort of evolution skepticism attach to, right? And we find that it tends to be bundled with the fear of the scientist, fear of atheists in particular. It's not actually very bundled with climate change skepticism, which actually was a kind of novel finding for our research group at Rice University and our Religion and Public Life program, actually something that a student of mine, Dan Bolger, first was curious about. So that was interesting to us. Climate change skepticism is much more attached to politics. Actually, people who are quite traditionalist religiously and who attend a lot, if we take politics out of the equation, Republican politics out of the equation, they are actually much less likely to be climate skeptics. So church attendance is a bit of a protective effect. We called folks that are, they state that they're Christians but don't attend church very much as sort of what we might think of as Fox News Christians, right? They have a high likelihood of having a Republican identity, a Christian identity, but that's decoupled from actual participation in the community. And those folks are climate change skeptics. But as soon as you add high church attendance in there, even if you are traditionalist on every other way of measuring being a traditional Christian, you tend to not be as skeptical of climate change if we take politics out. So those are kind of, so I think as a sociologist, you can think about like how things hang together, and then what does that say if we are interested in making some kind of social intervention? So maybe I'm an evolutionary biologist who's a Christian, and I want to encourage folks to consider evolutionary biology as a way of honoring God. So perhaps that's my problematic. You could use research like I've just described to think through the best way to address issues of evolutionary biology in your church, right? So that's kind of how I think about it as a Christian. Like I'm just trying to describe what's going on and what the relationships are, and then we can think about how we might want to use that research for different kinds of aims.
That's a really interesting summary. And I keep up on a lot of these statistics and hadn't heard some of those before. So that's really intriguing. Thank you for sharing from your knowledge there. Gabriel writes, Dr. Ecklund, thank you for sharing all your insights as a graduate student. I'm finishing up a graduate program in criminal justice and have been struggling how to apply my curiosity regarding the incorporation of Christian perspectives into the field of social sciences and using that as a framework in future service capacities. Do you have any advice on how to direct my postgraduate curiosity?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I think I have this would take a much longer conversation, and I'm happy to be an email contact if that's useful. So I think you want to somehow find a group of people who are asking this same type of question. So Christians in the social sciences, I think groups like this one can go a long way to being almost like relational matchmakers. I mean, I was part of like a Christians in sociology group at one point, and I found, a friend there that we continued to talk and pray, and we ended up having children the same age, and then later on, and we've known each other probably for 20 years. And this was from a group that I went to as a PhD student for Christians in sociology. So I think taking advantage of those kinds of things can be extremely useful. And then I do think you want, and this doesn't have to be discipline-specific conversation partners, but I think you want to also surround yourself with a church community and people who think that your discipline and academic work in general, the tools from that academic work can be utilized towards Christian-focused justice aims. And I think that's important to have encouragers, because there certainly are sets of Christians who might say, this academic work cannot be used well. And so I think you want to try to surround yourself, not saying that you want to totally avoid any critique or criticism, but I do think you want a few people in your life who maybe are outside the discipline who say, gosh, I really believe that you could use this well, and I want to hold you accountable to using it well. And then I think I would read widely. There's been a lot written about Christian approaches to justice. there's been so much written about incarceration and the criminal justice system. I think there's very good social science and sociological research on racism in the criminal justice system, and then to read widely and then think about how to view that work through a Christian lens, I think would be very important intellectually.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine. We are getting towards the end of our time, but just in case you didn't see them in the chat, I just also wanted to share a few nice comments that people made. Mike says, the Rice Graduate Christian Fellowship loves you, and I was immensely grateful for your postdoc journey with RGCF.
Oh.
Yeah, and Tim, who asked the question about different subfields of science and religion, says, very helpful, right along the lines of what I was curious about. So wanted to share those before we move on there. If you have additional questions, feel free to send them to ESN, and we'll see if Elaine has time to answer them. If you don't, that's totally fine. But feel free to send them to us, and we'll be happy to see if that's possible.
I put my email in there as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind. Yeah, so you can email Elaine directly then if you have follow-up questions. And we're delighted that you're able to join us. We have a few more announcements. One I'll mention is that, as Elaine's pointing us towards finding communities, we have on our Facebook page small networking groups for various fields. And we don't have quite as many in the social sciences yet as we would like, but we're continuing to build that. If you're interested in starting one or participating in one, you can get in touch with Bob Truby, and also keep checking the Facebook group because we're adding them regularly as people are interested to start them. So once more, we just really encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to get Elaine's book at 30% off. As you see, there is the link that you can use to get that 30% off. Would really encourage you to read that. And then we also have our next upcoming ESN Conversation, which we're excited about. And if you're interested in the social sciences, this is also a good one to attend. Useful for everyone, but it's about a book called Enhancing Christian Life by psychologists Brad Strong and Warren Brown. And they have looked at different ways using the discipline that they call extended cognition, that Christian life connects us to other people and to certain kinds of objects and to a concrete incarnated experience of the world and how that interacts with neuroscience. And one way I'm excited for this talk is I've found in these times when we're mostly on Zoom and so on, that I've had to reinvent some of my spiritual disciplines in slightly different ways than I usually do them. And I think that their take on spiritual disciplines will be very useful for us in general, but also in this particular time. So we are just so delighted, Elaine, that you could join us, and so thankful for everyone who turned up and asked questions, and for all the different ways that you brought your thoughtfulness into this conversation. So thank you all very much. And we'll end the recording pretty soon and unmute participants. We'll still have screen share locked, but you can have a little bit more of an informal conversation after we've wrapped up here for a few minutes if you have additional questions or just want to chat with people and have time to stick around. Bob, any other details before we swap more into the post-conversation chat?
Nothing on this end. I think you've done a great job with it. Thank you. Just add my own thanks to Elaine for joining us today. And thank you to all of our participants who have. And we hope you'll join us for our next conversation.
Thank you again. And do feel free to stick around and chat for a little bit as you have time.
Okay, we're ending the recording.